Hello, scholars. Okay, so this week we are going to be talking about organizing our speech as well as developing our speech introduction and conclusion. This video, because I don't want the videos to be too long, is going to focus solely on organizing our speech. So let me share my screen. Oh, I don't want to do that. Okay. All right. So organizing our speech. So it's very important that we have a particular style of organizing and formatting our presentation so that the information flows smoothly. We want our audience to be able to clearly understand exactly what our message is. And typically, it's easier for audience members to understand if our message is clearly organized. Remember from chapter 1 when we talked about the definition of communication and the fact that the sole purpose of communication is to use messages to generate meaning. When we say generate meaning, we're suggesting that we want a certain level of understanding when we deliver our messages. This is true not only for interpersonal communication, but also public speaking. We want our audience members to understand our message and be able to keep up as we transition from point to point. So typically, you'll find at least two main points in any presentation. And more than likely, in an academic setting like this class, we're not going to have more than 5 main points because we don't want to lose our audience members. We don't want our speech to be so clustered with so much information that our audience members experience listening fatigue or information overload. So we want to limit our main points to between 2 to 5 main points. So one of the most well-known or most widely utilized organizational patterns is called chronological. And chronological organization pattern is based on discussion of events or processes. So we're looking at time and or sequence. Time being definite, definitive things that have already been established within our society. We have seconds, we have minutes, we have hours, we have days, weeks, months, seasons, years, decades, centuries. All of it is well established. So if we talk about a topic in regard to a set time frame in particular points in time, then that would be known as chronological order. Also, anytime that we are talking about processes that don't necessarily have particular time constraints, but they definitely have a sequential order. There's a step-by-step protocol for these events or these, excuse me, not these events, but these processes, then that also falls on a chronological order. Here's an example. Esports began in the 1980s. Esports became a global phenomenon during the 1990s. Esports flourished through official tournaments in the 2000s. As you can see, we're listing events as they occurred in regard to time, specifically decades. A secondary organizational pattern is spatial order, and spatial order follows a pattern of direction, location, proximity. So when I learned the planets, I learned them in order from the closest to the sun to the farthest from the sun. So this was an example of spatial organizational pattern because it follows a direction. It's based on the location of the main points. A secondary option might be if we were talking about giving directions to giving directions to a particular location, and you said you'll hit this spot, and then if you go in this direction, you'll hit this spot, and if you go in this direction, you'll hit a follow-up spot. So that would also be considered spatial order. An example might be a discussion of a hurricane working from the innermost part of the hurricane outward to the outside. Here's a short video.
Eye of the hurricane. Let's take a look at the next ring of the storm. Surrounding the eye of the hurricane is the eye wall, a dense ring of clouds that produce the most wind and rainfall. It's very hard to see the eye wall from above, but you can see it more clearly in this graphic. The eye is the lighter colored area in the middle, and the eye wall is the darker area on the sides. Winds in the eye wall exceed 155 miles per hour, which is why this part of the storm can cause so much destruction.
Very similar to the examples I gave, he explains what you should expect at each point of a particular location in the hurricane. If I wanted to elaborate on the example that I gave about directions, you might recall times where you've been given directions and someone said maybe you should go to the corner on the left, and once you reach that corner you'll see a McDonald's on your right. You make that right and you go down 2 blocks and you'll see a red and blue house with a black Toyota in the yard. So you're explaining what will be recognized at each point, at each location. A third type of organizational pattern is causal. Causal is also recognized or considered to be cause and effect because you're basically showing or illustrating through your presentation in your main points that there is in fact a cause and effect relationship. For example, one might say that the United States faces a growing shortage of trained nurses in all parts of the country. A follow-up point might be if this shortage continues, it will strain the entire healthcare system. Sometimes we don't suggest what will continue, we suggest what has happened as a result of what has already been discussed in our presentation. So another example might be that due to an increased number of automobile usage in heavily populated areas, cause emissions have gone up and the ozone layer is depleting, or a better example might be to discuss the level of smog that's located in the area based on the heavy population and uses of automobiles. A fourth type of organizational pattern is problem solution. This is very similar to cause and effect as it typically has two main points. With this example, rather than just suggesting that these are two events that have occurred, we suggest that one event has occurred which caused another event, but within that way of thinking, we want to also suggest that there is something else that can be done. There is a suggestion, there is a call to action, there is something else that can be done that might improve this situation. For example, puppy mills are a serious problem across the United States. Problem. Solution is solving the problem requires legislation and individual initiatives. Note that when you present this solution, there will be several subheadings to justify or to elaborate on what legislation and individual initiatives might be incorporated.
In addition to suffering from physical problems, dogs in puppy mills are often emotionally unstable. Some are dangerously violent and aggressive. Others are apathetic and lack any desire to interact with people or animals. Because of the overcrowding in puppy mills, some animals literally go crazy and chew off the ears, legs, and tails of other dogs. But you can see for yourself what the dogs have to endure. Here's a picture of a puppy mill provided by the U.S. Humane Society. As you can see, the cages are stacked one on top of another, and the dogs are packed into the cages like sardines into a can. The dogs are not let out to go to the bathroom, so the cages are filled with waste and become breeding grounds for the diseases I mentioned earlier in my speech. You can get a better sense of how disgusting a puppy mill is from this photo, taken after the dogs were removed by animal officials. You can see how narrow the cages are and how they're crammed one against the other. You can see that there's filth and debris everywhere.
Another organizational pattern is topical. Now, topical organizational pattern has a great list of subtopics or items that fall under a particular category. So typically, when we talk about topical order, we're talking about a subject that is going to be a dominant or overarching focus of the presentation, but multiple things about this particular subject or that fall under this particular subject will be discussed in subtopics. So this might be an individual person that you're discussing, or it might be an event that's being discussed. More than likely is an item, a thing, or a concept or idea. So an example might be sports. Sports is a perfect example because you could talk about as your main topic that there are a few major money generating sports that are played in the United States professionally. Under that, you could talk about or share details regarding basketball, football, and baseball. That would definitely be topical order. And another example is to talk about Josephine Baker, who, one, captivated audiences in Europe and America, two, gathered information on Nazi activity, and three, was a civil rights activist. So when you are thinking about your main points and you're trying to organize your presentation, make sure that you keep your main points separate. You don't want to cause confusion. Remember, the whole point of organizing your speech is to ensure that there's a good flow of information and that your message is clearly understood. Make sure that you include signposts or transition throughout your presentation to mark the movement from one main point to another. Try a similar pattern of wording. Try to build in cadence in your presentation. Balance time devoted to each. You do not want to focus on one main point for the majority of the time and just barely touch on others. It seems like an afterthought, and you want to make sure that your audience members understand that you've clearly planned out your presentation, that every step was strategic, and that you're considering all aspects of the message to make sure that they understand whatever you're discussing completely. When you are thinking about your supporting material, make sure that if you have multiple subtopics under your main points, that is a consistent thing throughout your presentation. You don't want to just touch on one main point, but clearly elaborate on other main points as discussed previously. Connectives. Connectives are words or phrases that connect ideas that serve as signposts or transitional statements throughout your presentation. Some of these include transitions, internal previews, internal summaries, and signposts. A transition indicates that a speaker has finished one thought and is moving to another. For example, someone might suggest that I have spoken so far of Cesar Chavez and the community organizer, but it was his work as a labor leader that truly etched his name in American history. As you'll note from this, it's obvious that the speaker is transitioning from his discussion about Chavez as a community organizer and now is moving on to the main point of him being a labor leader. So this is not stated explicitly as, now that I've talked about him as a community organizer, I am now going to discuss his work as a labor leader. But it is definitely understood that the next main point is going to be that Chavez was a labor leader. Internal previews are statements in the body indicating what a speaker will discuss next. For example, in discussing how Asian Americans have been stereotyped in the mass media, we'll look first at the origins of the problem and second at its continuing impact today. Hi. So if we talk about the continuing impact of Asian Americans being stereotyped, it's understood that this is the next thing that we're going to touch on. An internal summary is a statement in the body that summarizes a preceding point or multiple points. For example, in short, palm reading is an ancient art. We go on to discuss that developed in China more than 5,000 years ago, it was practiced in classical Greece and Rome, flourished during the Middle Ages, survived the Industrial Revolution, and remains popular today in many parts of the world. This gives our audience members an idea that these are the four main points that we're going to discuss: the origin, at which point in time this particular thing flourished, what went on that allowed this particular thing to survive, and the idea that this thing is still being practiced today. Our last point is that signposts are brief statements showing where speakers are and focusing attention on key ideas. For example, the first cause of the problem is inefficient agricultural production. The second cause is recurrent drought in the affected countries. And the final cause is mismanagement of available food resources by local leaders. It's obvious in this example that these are going to be our main points, and we can re-reference those main points at any time during our presentation. Okay, guys, that is all. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out at any time. Have a great week.